This is the second video on pollination and dispersal, looking into our dispersal agents and pollinators. So we can also think about other pollinators that might be out at night. Moths. So moth pollination is really similar to bat pollination in some respects. The flowers tend to be that tubular shape so that you can keep the nectar at the base to avoid giving that nectar away to other pollinators. And we tend to have a strong sweet scent, which is the biggest difference. So this is going to be more similar to things that bees and butterflies would like, and less of that kind of like fruity, sickly smell. Here we see an example of a moth-pollinated flower. This is Darwin's orchid, and Darwin's orchid has this really long nectar spur. And a nectar spur is this petal-like structure that is a tube that contains nectar down at the bottom. So the flower secretes nectar into that compartment, into that nectar spur, in hopes that something with a long proboscis, which is like a tongue or a straw, is going to go into that tube, get the nectar from the bottom. And the plant doesn't necessarily want its nectar to be taken, but what it wants is to lure something in so that it can deposit pollen onto the head of that organism and then pick up pollen from the head of that organism that came from another flower. The more specific you can be with your pollinators, the more likely it is that the pollen that gets deposited on you is from your same species and you can successfully reproduce. So this particular flower co-evolved with a moth that when this flower was found, they didn't know the existence of that moth, right? There was no moth or no pollinator with a proboscis long enough to get to the base of that nectar spur. So they predicted the existence of this moth based on the length of the nectar spur of this flower. I can't remember how much long, it was like found maybe like 100 years later or something. I don't know. I'm going to give you fake information here, but not on purpose. So thinking about how specific these co-evolved relationships can be between a pollinator and its flower. Another important part of this is that with this nectar spur being so long and that coevolution and selection, right? Over time, the flower was selected for to have a longer and longer nectar spur to try to keep more of its nectar, right? So the longer your nectar spur, the less likely you are to have other pollinators stealing that nectar from you, not visiting your same flower. Whereas the moth, trying to access that nectar, whoever has the longer proboscis gets more nectar, gets to reproduce and have more offspring, theoretically, right? Spends less time visiting flowers, more time reproducing. And so that longer proboscis is also selected for, which keeps then selecting for that longer nectar spur. However, if one of these organisms goes extinct due to other factors, right, because of climate change or insecticides or just random extinctions, right? If one of these goes extinct, that is possibly going to lead to the extinction of the other, particularly for the flower. If this insect goes extinct, it's not going to necessarily have a way to reproduce anymore. You might still get a few insects trying to get into this nectar spur, and perhaps the nectar spur would just shorten over time. But these really intricate coevolutionary strategies are excellent for getting efficient pollination, but are dangerous in the face of biodiversity loss. So just keep that in mind. The next type of pollination we'll look at is fly pollination. Now the type of fly pollination we're looking at is flies who are not intending to be pollinators but who get tricked into pollination. That's a very specific type of pollination syndrome we can look at. However, there are tons of flies who do important pollination of many types of flowers, but they're very similar to bees. And so their pollination syndrome would be really conflated with bee pollination and be tricky to pick it apart. So know that there are many fly pollinators out there who do many important pollination jobs, but the ones we're going to look at are the ones who are being tricked into pollination. And so they have a very different pollination syndrome. So if you think about what these flies might be tricked, maybe they are looking for dung or for rotting meat where they would want to lay their larvae, where they would have this nutrient-rich food source to grow in. So here is what some of those fly pollinated flowers look like. We tend to get these dark purple or red colors that would have that sort of rotting meat vibe to them. They tend to be either sticky or in some way trap-like because we are luring flies to us, but we don't have the thing that they want, but we need them to stick around. So we have to have some way to get them to stick around long enough to get pollen onto them and to get pollen off of them and onto us. So how we're going to do that is going to depend on which type of flower we are. So the flowers tend to be dark red, purple, or maroon, and they often have a scent like rotting meat. Their general morphology is usually inclusive of a trap. So you might have like a pipe vine flower, has like a little U bend in it, so that, and it has a little lid. So when a fly flies in here, it feels stuck and it's going to like bump around as much as possible. And in that process, it's going to deposit pollen and pick up pollen, and then it will eventually escape. And then it's going to get lured into another flower where it's going to do the same thing and deposit pollen and pick up pollen. So we're not trying to trap them forever because we're not trying to eat them. We just want to get them to stick around for a little while and trick them into doing our bidding. And often because of that, there's no reward. You don't have to give them food. You don't want them to come and eat all your food. You're just trying to get them to take some pollen and leave some pollen. Beetles are also important pollinators. Beetles are super diverse. Often the first thing you kind of learn when you get into studying any sort of insect is how many beetles there are, because so many people study beetles and have cataloged the diversity of beetles. Here's some examples of beetle pollinated flowers, and I'm going to be really general with this too. Again, we're talking general pollination syndromes. There's going to be beetles who are attracted to very specific things because they're so diverse and there's been so much coevolution. So we tend to have these large white surfaces. So white to green is going to be a color that attracts beetles, and then the large surface is so that they have a spot to land because they're not going to be able to hover to pick up pollen like a bee or a hummingbird would be able to do. So colors-wise, they tend to be greenish or white. And they tend to be large, flat flowers. You might also have a large, flat inflorescence like an umbel or corm. They tend to be heavily scented. Beetles have a pretty good sense of smell. That scent might be spicy or fruity, or it might smell bad. It depends on what that beetle's typical food source is. And the rewards tend to be both pollen and nectar, similar to bees. I'll put a little video that David Attenborough does about these giant Amazon water lilies, and it shows this beetle pollination syndrome in a really interesting way this flower has evolved. So now let's practice. You want to look at this flower and say, who pollinates it? You're going to look at the color, you're going to look at the overall shape, and if you are looking at it in person, which I wish that you were, you would be smelling it also, right? You always want to check on that scent. So the two colors that we have are this sort of violet, purple, and yellow, and we have these sort of lines pointing us to the center. And if we were to look at this flower, it would be more or less flat with a kind of area that would be indented where our stigma and the rest of the carpel is. So this is a bee-pollinated flower, which you can tell mostly just based on the colors, but the overall morphology works too. A bee would be able to land on this flower and walk around. So here we're looking at a flower that is red. It is tubular, very long and skinny. Those two things should point you directly to birds. You can smell it. It might have a smell, it might not. Typically they won't have a smell. However, these might also use butterflies as pollinators. So that would be an opportunity to kind of use a few different options for this flower. You can see here, this is where the anthers are. They're ready to, or sorry, that's where the stigma is, ready to pick up pollen. This is a large white open flower. So this would be a great spot for beetles to land and walk around and make their way down here to try to get to where the nectar is, and in the meantime get pollen all over them and maybe deposit some pollen. This one's tricky. You would want to be thinking, what time of day is this open? Because we have a white flower that's tubular and it's pendant, so it's dangling. This would be difficult for a bee to kind of walk around on. It could get up in there, but it would have a difficult time kind of resting. So a bumblebee might fly into there, knock some pollen onto itself, and fly back out again. But it'd be difficult to access the nectar. So for this one, with that tubular shape, you might be thinking birds. If it has a strong sweet scent, and if it's open at night, you would be thinking moths. Typically, if this were bat pollinated, we would have more anthers out here to try to get pollen on them sort of as quickly as possible. Here's a tricky one. So this is not one that we've seen yet. Where's the flower, right? Where's the petals? What color is this? It doesn't really have a scent. It doesn't really have much of a color at all. All this really has are anthers and stigmas, these feathery stigmas. So we have anthers sticking way out there, huge anthers, feathery stigmas. What would that be for? So wind-pollinated flowers tend not to look much like flowers at all. Often there's no perianth, which you'll remember is the corolla and the calyx together. They tend to have huge conspicuous anthers, so just sticking all the way out there, and then we'll have these big anthers with lots of pollen just ready to be blown away. They tend to have large feathery stigmas, so the stigmas would be sticking out into the air with many branches to be able to kind of net that pollen out of the air. And there's not any nectar or scent because the wind isn't hungry and it doesn't care who you are or what you smell like. If you did smell like anything, it's just going to take that smell with it, right? So the wind is non-selective, so we are just trying to get as much pollen out there as possible and then filter as much as we can from the air. There's our wind-pollinated flowers again. Huge anthers, long filaments, feathery stigmas. No real perianth to speak of. Here's some more examples of wind-pollinated flowers. Again, you can see our anthers here are gigantic, hanging off of these tiny little filaments. And then this has a little bit better view of these feathery stigmas. Plants will sometimes go through this phase where they have a male phase and then a female phase. So they are trying not to pick up their own pollen. Here you can see we have anthers really far out here, sticking out into the wind.